while you were talking, I was trying to run through the years and come up with some other notable games, and I'll try to keep these in order because my mind went all over the place. So starting in 1999, there was a matchup in the Orange Bowl between Alabama and Michigan in which there was a bit of a run versus pass duel of Sean Alexander against Tom Brady, and there were changing of 14-point leads in that game. Both teams came back from 2 touchdown deficits, and there was a missed PAT in overtime for Alabama that handed Michigan the Orange Bowl 35-34. 2004, just kind of a precursor to Vince Young's record-setting performance and heroics at the end of the Rose Bowl to win the national championship, was a year earlier. He took on Michigan, and that was an extremely exciting game. It was something in the 37-35 range, and there needed to be a Vince Young drive late in the game to knock off the Big Ten champion Wolverines.
And, of course, after that game, he famously said, "I'll be back here next year." He guaranteed Texas to be back in the BCS championship game the next year.
You know, I don't remember that.
Yep.
It's interesting stuff. You mentioned the Utah team defeating Pitt in the Fiesta Bowl, and that not really impressing much of college football nation, because at the time the Big East had an automatic entry into the BCS bowls, and typically that team, except for a couple of West Virginia teams that were justified and certainly proved it on the big stage against the likes of Georgia and Oklahoma, there were some pretty weak teams that made it through. So that Utah team under Urban Meyer defeated like an 8-5 Pitt team and took care of them pretty handily, like 35-7. You know, I'm going to go to a Rose Bowl between Oregon and Wisconsin with Russell Wilson winning or playing and quarterbacking Wisconsin that one season to the Big Ten championship. He was throwing the ball in the end zone to try to win the game, but Oregon held on. It was like a 42-38 game. Michigan State, ironically, you don't think of them being too exciting, but they had back-to-back years in which they won an entertaining Rose Bowl against Stanford in 2013. If you love defensive football, but enough offense to keep it a kind of a healthy game at like 24-20. Interesting game right there. And then the next year, they trailed Baylor by 21 points in the fourth quarter in the Cotton Bowl, came back and beat Baylor the first year of the playoff, but this just being a New Year's Six game, Michigan State over Baylor 42-41. The Ohio State-Alabama game in the first year of the playoff, certainly up until this year, was the most entertaining of the semifinal games. 2 heavyweights going at it. Buckeyes defeat Alabama in this one. Zeke Elliott goes like 85 yards to cap it. Of course, the 2 Alabama-Clemson games, which I believe you mentioned as honorable mentions, 2015 and 16, I also came to mind for me. So it's just a good topic to kick around in regards to what we've seen over the last 20 years, Mike.
You know, a couple of notes on that. You mentioned Alabama a couple of times. That lost to Michigan. You know, they're actually on the losing side of the games that people mention as the greatest games in this era. They lost to that Michigan game. They lost one of the games to Clemson. They lost the game to Ohio State you were talking about. And then they lost to Utah in the Sugar Bowl, which was probably the most embarrassing defeat Alabama's had in the Nick Saban era. In the Sugar Bowl, home of the SEC, postseason, against a G5 team, and Utah came out and just won that game decisively. The other game, you talked about the Big East. I believe it was West Virginia, that West Virginia team you talked about, that really beat up Clemson in the Orange Bowl several years ago. And that was sometimes you look at programs and they suffer these defeats, and the program just goes downhill from there. But Clemson's the opposite. After that defeat in the Rose Bowl or the Orange Bowl, and it was a bad defeat. I think it was like 70-23 or
33. Yes.
70-33. After that devastating loss, people thought that Clemson was done for. And really, that was the spark of Clemson moving to the highest echelon of college football. Dabo Swinney, it just looks like, from the outside in retrospect, it looks like that loss really spurred Clemson to really take it to the next step. So those are a couple more interesting tidbits about that Alabama being kind of on the losing end, and the Clemson's humiliation before they turned it around and became a top-tier team to a Big East team, West Virginia, that people really didn't have a lot of respect for because they came out of what would eventually become the American Athletic Conference, Group of 5 conference.
Even though there were a couple games in which West Virginia played extremely well, they beat an Oklahoma team that was ranked in the top 5 or 6 in the nation at the Orange Bowl in like 07, 08. It couldn't have been the Boise State year, of course. I think it was the year after. No, Oklahoma won or played in the national championship against Florida. It was somewhere in that 05-06 range. It might have been 06. West Virginia took it to Oklahoma like 48-28. They beat an SEC champion in Georgia at the Sugar Bowl like 38-35. So West Virginia probably defended the Big East as well as anyone. The other years, there were some poor performances of the likes of Cincinnati and UConn and some other schools.
And Pittsburgh. Well, all those games that you mentioned about West Virginia is the reason why they're in the Big 12 now, and not in a G5 conference.
Yeah, and you mentioned Utah. It's interesting to note. The stat comes up about every year, and it just continues to compile. Is that Utah, in beating West Virginia in this past bowl season, again wins another postseason game. I believe they're now 13-1 under Urban Meyer and Kyle Whittingham in postseason play. Now, you would consider most of those to be lower tier bowls, but there's the Fiesta Bowl against Pitt, and there's that Sugar Bowl game against Nick Saban and Alabama just prior to their national championship run in 2009.
Yeah, very impressive. And playing in a Power 5 conference now in the Pac-12, even if they play maybe a team that finished a couple slots below them in their conference, with this long season that you have in the Power 5 conference, the wear and tear that it takes. Still, I thought they were 11-1, maybe it's 13-1. Bottom line is they've had an impressive decade and a half in the postseason. It's even more impressive now they've been in the Pac-12 for a couple of years.